conflict in Gaza, we have Jews, Muslims, and Christians all involved in this conflict. How do you see the responsibility of the Biden administration in dealing with this issue? Because Biden always bragging about being a Christian. He's a good Christian. I'm going to take care of people of faith.
This is a sad subject, Nima. You say that Biden prides himself on being what is called in this country a practicing Catholic. Well, I just wish he'd practice more, you know. I just wish he'd learn more about what it means to be a Christian, not just a Catholic, and actually to be a Jew and to be a Muslim, because we all come out of this same Abrahamic tradition. And what not many people realize, and which I learned only belatedly, that's one good thing about getting old, and you get lots of experience, okay? What I learned is that Yahweh of the Hebrew scriptures and Jesus of Nazareth and the prophet, they share a belief, a strong belief, that the most important thing is that we do justice, okay? It's a common strain going through all these traditions, the Abrahamic tradition. Now, when I was in college, people said, "Well, you know, what's ethics? Or what do you mean by justice?" And we were taught, "Oh, that's simple. You do good and you avoid evil." Okay, sounds sensible. And I learned they only got that half right. You don't avoid evil; you confront it. Okay, I had to learn that from rabbis, from Protestant priests and Protestant ministers, a couple of Catholics who espouse liberation theology. And, you know, it really goes back to actually the first word for justice in the sacred scriptures, pre-Aramaic, like, you know, the language that Jesus spoke, pre-Aramaic, the word for justice was showing mercy to the poor. I mean, like that was the definition. Like, it's not the connotation or anything like that. Justice, tzidkah, meant showing mercy to the poor. Okay, wow. So gradually I learned that, well, you know, if, as Rabbi Heschel said, he said when, and Rabbi Heschel died just recently, over the last couple of years, he said, you know, when injustice happens, we're not all guilty, but we all are responsible. Ignorance or forgetting about injustice is worse than injustice itself. Now, took a lot of sort of metanoia, a little turning around my mind here to figure out, well, you know, if you're going to be a follower of not only Jesus of Nazareth, which I try to do, but Yahweh and the prophet, who is good on these things, then that means doing mercy to the poor, showing mercy to the poor. Now, okay, that's a long-winded way of saying, what are we doing in Gaza? For the first time in my life, for the first time in the life of America, our president is participating, enabling, arming those who are doing genocide in Gaza. There's no two ways about it. Now, I was old enough to live throughout World War II. I was born 1 week before it started, all right? I don't remember much about the war except waiting for a quarter of a pound of butter at 5 years old. But I do remember what happened, and that was genocide, all right? Now, does it have to be 6 million? No. After the war, the international law was codified to make it very clear it doesn't have to be the whole ethnic group. It can be part of it, but the intent and the actions were equally important. Now, one good thing is that there has been a UN referral to the International Court of Justice, and that could result in restraining Israel and the United States. But my concern is it's going to take too long. So when I saw that a Lutheran priest in Bethlehem, like Bethlehem, right, where Jesus is supposed to have been born, he made a really gutsy speech, and he called out religious leaders as well as secular leaders. His name is Reverend Munter Isaac. He called out what he termed the Church of Empire, as well as the Western leaders' hypocrisy about human rights, as if they don't apply to the Palestinians. Religious denominations, he said, take refuge in the meaningless platitudes and empty words of empathy. I say again, empty words of empathy. Wow, empty empathy. There you go. He said, God stands always on the side of the oppressed, unequivocally on the side of the oppressed. Now, that reminded me of all these learnings that I learned earlier on. And, it's such a tragedy that the Jews themselves, having suffered Holocaust, would be calling, as one senior secular leader did just a couple of weeks ago, for Shoah, Holocaust, using the same word, Holocaust, against the Palestinians. And Western leaders, and what pains me most, Western churches, the ones that call Biden a practicing Catholic, can't find their voices. Now, I don't want to sound preachy about this, but I was asked 4 years ago, hey, on your Twitter feed, you're a justice person. What does that mean? And so I said, oh, okay, I'll write about that. And I did exactly 4 years ago. It appeared in Consortium News on the 1st of January, 2020. Now, in that, I treat a little bit what I know about post-World War II. Now, I was young, right? So I didn't learn this at the time, but I learned later that in critiquing the church's position in World War II, the Dominican monastery in La Tour Marbourg, France, invited Albert Camus to come and talk to them about how he saw the conduct, the behavior of the church writ large during World War II, during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. Okay. Now, they knew Camus was an atheist, but they also knew that he spoke the truth. And so I give it over to them. I applaud them for inviting him. I'm going to just read just a little bit of what Camus said, because it relates so much to what's going on now and to the continuing silence of the church. Here's Camus. It's 1948, so 3 years after the war. For a long time during those frightful years, I waited for a great voice to speak up in Rome. I, an unbeliever? Precisely, for I knew that the spirit would be lost if there were no cry of condemnation. It has been explained to me since that condemnation was indeed voiced, but it was in the style of encyclicals. And so I, Camus, asked, what is an encyclical? The condemnation was voiced and it was not understood. Whose fault is that? What the world expects of Christians is that Christians should speak out loud and clear, and they should voice their condemnation in such a way that never a doubt, never the slightest doubt, could rise in the heart of a simplest man, that they should get away from abstraction, and confront the blood-stained face that history has taken on today. We need men resolved to speak out clearly and to pay up personally. Lastly, what I know This is Camus finishing up. What I know and what sometimes creates a deep longing in me is that if Christians made up their mind to it, millions of voices, I say millions, would be added to a handful of isolated individuals who today intercede almost everywhere and ceaselessly for children, so that no more children would be killed, as Roger Waters would say. So I just leave it at there. It's just really very painful that people stick to their monasteries and their seminaries and their universities and pretend that a person like Joe Biden is acting in a justice, much less a Abrahamic way. And this needs to be said. Maybe I'd add one more thing. Back in the day, like 20 years ago, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was head of a ecumenical church school. It was called the Servant Leadership School in Washington. And here's a very poignant little anecdote. I invited Bishop Gumbleton, a very progressive Catholic bishop from Detroit, who used to go to Iraq regularly and go to Syria and other places in the Middle East where the United States was committing so many atrocities by, for example, depriving young children of the necessary means to live. You'll recall Madeleine Albright, the previous Secretary of State, saying when she was asked, Leslie Stahl, the CBS reporter, but Secretary Albright, 500,000 children below the age of 5 dead because of those sanctions on Iraq? Do you think that's worth it? No, Albright said, yes, it's worth it. We think it's worth it. So anyhow, here is Gumbleton, just back from a trip from Iraq and having persuaded the rest of the American Catholic bishops to condemn those sanctions as unconscionable. Wow. Now, these were good bishops appointed by John the 23rd, okay? Unconscionable. So I asked Gumbleton to come and speak to this ecumenical group, and he did. And he talked about holding a child who he knew would be dead next time he went to Iraq and so forth. And one of the Protestant women raised her hand and said, "Now, Bishop Gumbleton, that was a really courageous statement you made, all your bishops made about how unconscionable it was to keep these sanctions in place. What kind of reaction did you get from the administration?" And I said to myself, oh no, Gumbleton's a straight shooter, and he's going to say something very embarrassing. And sure enough, he did. He said, well, ma'am, the administration looks on us as 225 possible votes. Now, if we went back to our dioceses and told all our pastors to preach this from the pulpit, then there are 65 million Catholics. Then they would take us seriously. But we don't. And the pastors don't. And everybody keeps their mouths shut. And I looked on at Tom Gumbleton, who was a good friend of mine. I looked at all the other people, 300 of them in this little hall, big hall. And it was like, oh, damn, it's the right word. Oh, damn. Where is the moral authority here? It's certainly not in the Catholic hierarchy now, today. And I had another experience. Maybe this is the last. I'll finish up with this. I was talking to a group of Presbyterians in Dallas, right after Bush stopped being president. And they were all thinking, oh, our neighbor Bush is so great because he saved us from more terrorism after 9/11. And, I couldn't understand this, especially since torture had come out then, all right? So I knew, because I keep up with these things, that the stated clerk that's the name for the interim chief of the Presbyterians, had made a really courageous statement saying torture is always wrong, always reprehensible, always wrong. And so I turned to the pastor, and as I was speaking, I said, now, Pastor, you certainly have shared that very gutsy, very courageous statement with your faithful here. And the pastor looked like the proverbial deer in the headlights and said, I'm not familiar with that statement, Mr. Mcgovern. And I said, well, now, isn't he sort of interim head of your, well, yes, but I could you give me the link? I looked at those people. I said, oh my God, here I was going to applaud them for this gutsy statement, and nobody knew about it. So it's nice to have encyclicals, like Camus said, nice to have empathetic type statements, but without work, without real activity, nothing's going to happen. And I'll just close with that, because one of my heroes is Cesar Chavez. And he used to always say, look, I got an idea. Let's do a grape boycott. That will get their attention, And everyone below him would say, Cesar, we can't do that. He said, why not? There aren't enough of us. And Cesar used to always say, there are enough of us, but without action, nothing's going to happen. And that's what we face right now. Without action, without speaking out and putting our bodies on the line, this support for genocide, not only in the United States, but also to a degree in Europe, it's going to continue until either most of those 2.3 million Palestinians are killed or driven into the desert in the Sinai. So enough of my preaching here. I just feel so torn by being the kind of believer that Camus was calling for back in 1948. I'm afraid I've become educated that it's not enough to do good and avoid evil. You have to confront it. That's the end of my little homily on my sermon for today. Now we can get to more practical matters if you wish. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say these things.
My pleasure, Ray. When it comes to the conflicts in the world, we see that China and Russia together try to bring Iran and Saudi Arabia together. And Russia is trying to help Azerbaijan and Armenia to talk to each other, to put their differences aside, to work on a common ground. When it comes to the US, there was a huge opportunity for the Biden administration in the case of Ukraine to negotiate with Russians right now in Gaza, to force the Netanyahu administration to find a political settlement in Gaza. But they're not doing this. They're not helping these people.
The answer is embarrassingly simple. President Biden styles himself as a self-admitted Zionist. Not a Jew, but a Zionist. There's a big difference, There's a political movement, and Zionists is a racist ideology which says that Jews are superior to other races. It's pure and simple, okay? That's that. Then there is the influence of the Israel lobby, not only on people like Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland, others, but also on the US Congress. There is so much money come from wealthy Jewish people in our country that they can determine whether someone is able to run for election in the primaries, for example, primary concept. They're down to that now. And they can determine whether a senator or a representative has enough money to get reelected. Okay, that's very potent. And the other thing is what I call the military-industrial, well, I was going to say military-industrial complex, but it's far more than that. We may have discussed this before, but maybe it's worth repeating what Eisenhower said is our major threat to our democracy was the growth, whether intentional or not intentional, of what he called the military-industrial complex. He was going to say military-industrial congressional complex, and that's in his speech, and it's crossed out. Now, was this true then as it is now? Why was it crossed out? Well, we asked Susan Eisenhower, his granddaughter, and she said, well, I crossed that out himself because he needed just a little bit more cooperation from Congress. So politics reigns supreme. But what I've coined is a new acronym, and it more appropriately describes how the MIC, the military-industrial complex, has grown. I call it a Mickey Mat. If you got a pencil, your listeners, you might want to take this down, right? It's on the final exam. Okay, got that? Okay. It's the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Now, if you think of all those institutions, they're all in on the act. When I say media, that's because media is the linchpin. Without the media, these other guys couldn't do all that they do. And who controls the media? The rest of the Mickey Mat. You see it infiltrating academia. You see it in all manifestations. And it's become, well, I just learned that 20% of US production is for arms. 20% of the whole US production of it is for armaments. And so that works into this because there are people, they're only 1%, but they're really powerful, right? And they control the wealth more than the next 95%. And they have this incredible influence on Congress. So they are profiteering on these wars. They are likely to try to keep them going. And if things peter out as they had 10 years ago in Europe, well, then pivot to the east, challenge China. Why challenge China? Because, as Joe Biden said, 2 months after he was inaugurated, China aspires to be the most powerful country in the world, not only economically, but politically and militarily. That's not going to happen on my watch. I thought to myself, oh no, why not? What are there, 1,400,000,000 people there? Why not? Do they threaten us? And the answer, of course, is, in my view, they do not threaten us unless we threaten them. And they have a way, the Chinese do, of saying, why can't we just get along? I mean, we have not only 3 centuries, we have kind of 3, what do you call them, millennia behind us. We've learned to kind of get along with people. We haven't been in a war since forever. Like maybe we had a dust up with the Vietnamese, but that didn't amount to much. We don't care about you guys. We just want to develop our own thing. Well, how about a live and let live? How about a win-win policy? Wow. What about a win-win policy? No way. Why? Because of the Mickey Mat, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. The think tanks and academia just suck up a lot of money from the federal government. So don't leave them off. It's the Mickey Mat supreme. So that's why I think that we continue to be in these wars. And unless we have some benign, unless we have more educated and less fearful. I mean, Biden, I think Biden's really afraid. I don't think he needs to be afraid, but his acolytes won't think to tell him, Mr. Biden, Russia's not going to go, and it's not going to go into Poland or the Baltics. I mean, it's not even go very far into Ukraine. Russia just wants this. They're afraid to tell them that because, just like the Chicoms in East Asia, you got the Russians going to take over the rest of Europe. It's crazy, and it could get us in a pile of trouble.
Antony Blinken just recently said that we have invested in Ukraine's democracy, in Ukraine's future, in its freedom. With what has happened to Ukraine so far, does it have anything to do with democracy, with freedom? Do you see any bright future for Ukraine?
Nima, Ukraine is a basket case. It all has to do with the real reasons why the U.S. is in Ukraine. And that was revealed by this not particularly bright fellow named Lloyd Austin when he was Secretary of Defense. And he talked about one of our aims is to weaken Russia. I quote, "We are going to move heaven and earth to make sure that Ukraine weakens and defeats Russia, period," end quote. Now, okay, that's sort of an expression. We're going to move heaven and earth, okay? But, it betrays an attitude that reflects a feeling that we can move heaven and earth. And you have Joe Biden himself talking to one of those interviewers, and the interviewer says, "Well, can you handle a two-front like with China and Russia?" And Joe Biden says, "Look, we're the United States of America, the most powerful country ever. Did you hear me? The most powerful country in the history of the world. In the history of the world. Come on." Well, I'm afraid he believes that. I'm afraid that Blinken and Sullivan, a little younger and a little brighter, are too afraid to tell him, "Joe, that's not the case anymore, okay? And we can't work our will against China and Russia." In my view, it's an ideological thing left over from the Red Scares of the 50s and 60s, but it's very mischievous, okay? It's going to get us in a lot of trouble because I think Biden actually believes that, and he thinks that the fate of the free world lies in his hands. And worse still, he thinks that Bibi Netanyahu is somebody that's worth supporting for as long as it takes. Whoa, that's what he used to say about Ukraine. Now he says about Ukraine, for as long as we can. Difference, okay? How long will it be? How many more thousands of Palestinians will have to be killed in Gaza before Joe Biden says, "Well, we're going to support that rightist government in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem for as long as we can." And it's up to us to put that end date on this, to tell the president, "You can do this no longer." And I dare say there are enough people that are upset about this, just as I am, that we can go ahead and make a difference here. Now, what I fear, and this is a legitimate fear in my view, this is the first time that one nuclear-armed superpower has challenged another nuclear-armed superpower, and this Russia superpower considers Ukraine a core interest, a key danger to its national security. Now, up till now, superpowers just, didn't challenge each other so frontally or with weapons. So what's different now? Well, I go back to President Kennedy, who was responsible for my coming down to Washington and so many of my colleagues. And what he said was, look, the last thing we should do is put a nuclear armed power before a choice between humiliation and defeat and acquiescing. Okay. Now, contrary to what Biden has said, it's not the Russians that have lost, it's the Ukrainians and the US. Now, it's not quite apparent to Americans yet, but it will have to become clear in the next couple of months because the Russians are on the move and the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, money, everything else. Okay. So what am I saying? Well, Biden and his acolytes are looking at this and say, oh my God, we tried to move heaven and earth. Heaven and earth isn't listening to us anymore. And maybe we're not all powerful. Maybe we're not, the United States of America anymore. Okay. So what do we do? Oh my God, there's an election. Now, those of you who know American politics know that in an election year, everything depends on the election. Okay. More so this time. Why? Because Joe Biden, if he loses the election, he'll go to jail. I'm not talking Hunter Biden. I'm talking Joe Biden. They've got the goods on him. I know enough about what the court documents say and what the various congressional hearings have said to know that if that very, very dangerous guy comes in instead of Joe Biden, he's going to be very vengeful. And it could be that Joe Biden, even in his dotage, will end up in jail. Not only him, but Hunter. Not only Hunter and him, but Jake Sullivan, who concocted Russiagate, and Tony Blinken, who concocted the fairy tale that Hunter's laptop was a Russian intelligence disinformation operation just a week or two before the election. And, well, anyhow. So these guys have a personal interest in not losing the war, because losing the war means they're losing the election and they might lose their freedom. Now, I do not exaggerate. That's how they have to look at this, in my view. And, in my view, you have to look at how Putin and his acolytes look at this. Putin has said in the past, U.S. foreign policy is a creature of domestic considerations. We ought to recognize that, be on the watch for that. Now, in an election year, that goes in spades. So what am I saying? I'm saying that Putin has to be very, very careful here, because, let's say the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this Air Force 4-star, that Defense Secretary Austin come to Joe Biden, like they did several months ago, and say, the Ukrainians want more 155 millimeter shells for the howitzers and for their artillery. And Biden would say, well, let's give them some bars. And so, oh, sir, we don't have any. You don't have, oh, we have enough, but we can't give any more away. Oh, well, tell the Europeans to give them. Oh, they don't have any either. Well, what else we got? Well, we got these cluster munitions. Many countries ban them, so we gave them. Now, what happens when we run out of cluster ammunition? Okay. I ask you, what happens? Now, these guys are crazy enough to say, well, up on that top shelf there with the lock, we have the combination, Mr. President. Those are the mini nukes, okay? And we could use a little mini nuke. And they're just small, maybe 1/10 the size of those bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, yeah, that'll show the Russians that they won't win this war in Ukraine. Now, would that happen? I wish I could say, no, it would never happen. But these guys are crazy. Putin has called them crazy. I'll just refresh your memory. 14 months ago at one of these long Q&As, he was asked, how do you judge the fact that the U.S. has taken on China as well as us in Ukraine? And what he says was, and I've memorized this, Putin. At first I thought there was some clever plot here, but I no longer think so. I think they're just crazy, I think one must attribute it to arrogance and a feeling of impunity, period, end quote. So, all right, why am I saying all this? I'm saying that I think Putin has to take that into account, the more so because he's got his generals behind him saying, look, Mr. President, we don't care whether Sullivan and Blinken intend to use a mini nuke. We know they have it. We look at capabilities, not intentions. So we have to be on high alert lest something like this happen before the election. That's big. And, when I hear myself saying this, I say, my God, is this the first time you've been so afraid, Mcgovern? And I have to answer, yeah, it is. And how many decades have you been at this? About 5, So never before has one nuclear power threatened another with a humiliating defeat or the use of these things. Russia, I think, is clever enough, Putin especially, to just gradually attrition, right? Attrit, not giving Biden any excuse to get involved with boots on the ground. But it worries me sick that Biden would get up just 10 days ago, as he did, and say, American forces might be facing Russian forces in Ukraine before long. Why is that? If Russia attacks one of our NATO countries. Oh, okay. So if. Now, just yesterday, there was a Russian shell that apparently flew over part of Poland. Poland protested, of course. What's to prevent some hothead in Ukraine or Poland or somewhere else from a false flag attack on a NATO country? What's to prevent that? That's happened before. Really weird things have happened before, like blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. The capability is there. So that would be the sine qua non for NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine, a attack on one of these NATO countries. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen, but if I were Putin, I would say, oh, well, this is a little signal here, okay? This is a little signal that maybe they do want to introduce NATO boots on the ground to stem this defeat. It's not going to work, but experience has shown that they don't realize these things aren't going to work. I mean, they should have listened to President Obama, who said Russia has escalatory dominance around Ukraine. Well, fancy word, right? You know what that means, being able to escalate in a dominant way, Now, Obama also said, and people forget this, is the worst thing we could do is give offensive weaponry to Ukraine. You know why? Because then we might mislead them into thinking that they could defeat a much superior country like Russia. Oh, Biden was vice president now. I don't know what he's doing when Obama reasoned to these very cogent conclusions, but he's done just the opposite. So it's a very delicate balance we have here. And my point is that the US doesn't really have any other options than these crazy mini nukes or a humiliating defeat in an election year. And if I were Putin, I'm not, of course, but my whole career was to put myself in the shoes of Russian Soviet leaders, okay? And I would have to be looking at this situation. It's very, very dangerous, the more so since the people who are vying to be nominees of various parties, most of them are as crazy as Putin, I'm sorry, as crazy as Biden in pretending that the US has to remain not only the exceptional country in the world, but the indispensable country in the world. And that went out with decades ago. And the problem is these people are so, they have such a feeling of arrogance and impunity, to quote Putin again, that they don't seem to realize that they certainly don't behave as though they understand it.
Germany have sent soldiers to Lithuania at the border with Russia. Spain has sent troops to Slovakia at the border with Russia. Do you see these type of movements as an escalation on the part of NATO?
It only makes sense in a public posturing sort of mode. The Germans, the rest of NATO, are very clearly not up to a war with Russia. The German defense minister said, Russia is a threat if we let them win in Ukraine, they're going to go all the way farther west, okay? So we're about 5 to 8 years behind them. We've got to build up our defense industries, our own Mickey Mat, if you will, to catch up. And in 5 to 8 years, we'll be able to catch up. So think about that. If the Russians were a threat, they're being told, look, now's the time to strike, because these guys are going to be ready to handle you for 5 to 8 years. And you have the head of the Netherlands just today saying, oh, we got to be prepared for a war with Russia. There is absolutely no sign, no indication that Russia wants anything more than to make sure that Ukraine is neutral, that it doesn't have offensive strike missiles in it, and that there's a sanitary cord there that would prevent the West from shelling people in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Lugansk, and that situation can return to the situation before we started a coup in Kiev and completed the coup in Kiev on 22 January 2014, which was announced on YouTube on the 4th of March 2014. So it was really and truly the most blatant coup in the history of mankind, having been announced by virtue of the leak of an intercepted conversation between Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, and the U.S. Ambassador in Kiev. I mean, it's there. It's a conversation saying who's going to be the next prime minister and who's going to come in to seal the deal. A fellow named Joe Biden, who was the vice president at the time, he'll come in. He's all set. How do we know that? Because his national security advisor, a guy named Jake Sullivan, he told Hillary Clinton, yeah, this is going to just work out just fine. So, I mean, there it is. It's all laid out. Do Americans know that? Well, not unless they listen to your program, Nima, and programs like it. And that's why I'm so delighted to be able to talk to you today.
There were Russian studies, Soviet Union studies in those days that were helping the policy of the United States toward Russia. We are experiencing the same issue with Arab states right now in the Middle East. How do you see this case for the US foreign policy? Are they going to getting better? Are they going to getting worse?
It's hard to think, Nima, how they could get much better. Remember the academia think tank last part of the Mickey Mat. At the end of the Soviet Union, when people were not expecting Russia to implode, and people like Bill Casey, head of the CIA, and Robert Gates, his deputy for analysis, were saying, the Russians are really bad. They will never give up power. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union will never, ever give up power without a major revolution or violence. Well, they were wrong. Did they suffer from that? No. What happened? We took advantage. It's very easy to say. We took advantage of the fall of the Soviet Union. We sent people from the Department of Treasury and Commerce, and we've sent the Harvard boys. The fellows knew how to privatize things, how to work with the oligarchs in Russia, the oligarchs in Ukraine, the oligarchs on Wall Street, and privatize and take over what was left of the Russian economy. It was so bad, Nima, that according to World Bank figures, between 1991 and 1995, Yeltsin years, right after the fall of the Soviet Union, the average age of a male, the mortality rate, or whatever you'd call it, when a male Russian would die, went from 61 to 57. No, I'm sorry, 63 to 57. 6 years. 6 years and 4 years. People dying on the street. The Harvard boys exploited that. They plundered the Russian economy, and Putin was around to watch all this. Not only that, but they started expanding NATO. Bill Clinton putting his arm around the drunken Yeltsin and saying, don't worry about it, we'll just be fine, So by some act of providence, in my view, Yeltsin looks around, maybe feels a pang of conscience as to what he's done to Russia. And he says, all right, maybe this guy can fix it. Putin, you're the man. And that was what, New Year's Eve, 1999. So what happened? Well, Putin started to say, well, this is great. George H.W. Bush used to talk about a Europe free and whole from Lisbon to Vladivostok. So why don't we join NATO? Well, what would you think of that? Well, these same oligarchs, these same Mickey Mouse people, hey, we need you to be an enemy, man. We can't build common European battle tanks and all this other stuff without an enemy. So sorry, no NATO. And the rest of the story unfolded. So consonant with that, or concurrent with that, was the Russian studies departments of all these universities, okay? Who gave money? The Mickey Mouse. What kind of ideology did they preach? The Russians are bad, the Russians are bad, the Russians will do this and that. So now with respect to Arabic studies, which is really a question, back in the day, when I was first coming on in government, 60s, 70s, there was a high degree of expertise at the State Department and at the CIA with respect to Arab as well as Israel policies. Matter of fact, when I came on in 1963 or so, I looked at the Arab-Israeli branch in the Office of Current Intelligence, the analysis group, and I didn't see any Jewish people there. And it struck me as odd, so I asked the branch chief, why are there no people of Jewish extraction here? And he said, well, this sounds un-American, but, people of Jewish extraction might have a little more difficulty being objective, being unbiased. And so we don't have any Arabs here either. So we're just trying to be extra cautious about bias and prejudice, okay? Well, that was the 60s. When I left 1990, there were no Arabs still, but there were lots of people of Jewish extraction. And I know it's gotten even more pronounced since I left. So you have that, and then you have people who are funding people that are in these Israeli or Middle East think tanks that are, George Soros or a lot of these other people that have a pretty biased view on all this kind of stuff. So there are no real Arabists left in the State Department that I know of. And I've been away from the CIA for a while, but there were very few when I left. They had one, let's see, what was his extraction? I think he was Turkic, who was working in the Arab-Israeli branch. That's as close as they came to a Palestinian. So what I'm saying here is that the bias and the prejudice that distorts justice, okay, is very rampant in these institutions. And it's really hard to get a straight answer. Now, let me just go back a little bit to what we were talking a little bit earlier. The ideal, of course, the American ideal is this justice lady with a blindfold on so she can't see either of the scales, right? So she's completely unbiased and unprejudiced. Now that's the ideal. That's the American concept of justice. Going back to what we started talking about, the biblical concept of justice is biased and prejudiced to the core in favor of the anuim, the old Aramaic word for the poor, the hated poor, the despised poor, the widow, the orphan, the refugee, the Gazan, the people in Gaza right now. So when we talk about unbiased, well, we can aspire to an unbiased view in our intelligence and our diplomatic work. It's really hard to come by, but the ideal is still set before Americans, no bias. Well, that's unbiblical. The biblical solution here is showing mercy to the poor, the denotation of the original word for justice in pre-Aramaic. Now, I just say one thing for myself. Now, when I learned all this, I took a certificate degree in theology at Georgetown University. There were lots of Jesuits there back from Central America. They taught me about liberation, la teología de liberación, okay? Liberation theology. And one of them actually went back to replace one of those 6 Jesuits that were killed, assassinated. His name was Dean Brackley. And he was not only a community organizer in the Bronx, where I grew up, he was also professor of theology with a doctorate from the University of Chicago. Okay, so he's a really smart guy. And he reduced it all for me. And he said, this is what Jesus preached, okay? He said, this is, and I've adopted this as sort of my thumbnail theology. Ready? It all depends on who you think God is and how God feels when little people are pushed around, and how God feels when little people are pushed around. That's the sum and substance of it. That's why I feel so aggrieved and so angry at the enabling role that my government is playing when 2.3 million Palestinians are pushed around. Sorry, I keep coming back to that, but that's first and foremost in my mind today.
And we have 5, was interested in knowing what I thought about this. Prophets are without renown in their hometowns and sometimes in their own homes. So when Miriam asked me this question, I said, well, she wants a short, concise paragraph, so I'll try. And I failed. I couldn't do it in one concise paragraph. I said, look, here's somebody who's genuinely interested. She has 3 young children. She's got a very busy life, but she knows that this is important. So let me explain some of the background to this. And so I started out first with the so-called religious justification for what Israel did, well, in occupying lands already occupied by Palestinian people for centuries before. I have been in the West Bank. I have been in Israel. At one point, we went up a hill to a Jewish settlement. This is about 8 years ago. Now, at the bottom of the hill, there was devastation. There was no running water. There was poverty of an extreme kind. When we went up to the top of the hill, whoa, looked like a golf course, for God's sake. Green lawns being watered, okay, and a rabbi from Cleveland telling us why he's entitled to be there as a settler. So one of my colleagues, we were on a little delegation, said, well, Rabbi, how do you explain the conditions right down at the bottom of this hill in Palestinian territory and your beautiful settlement up here? And he said without hesitation, well, God promised us this land. Now, I had heard that before, and I know not enough about what's so-called the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, but I knew this. I knew that they depend on Deuteronomy 15:4 for that. So I basically said, Rabbi, please cite the part of scripture that justifies your settling on this land. And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, Yahweh said to the Jewish people, you shall have this land flowing with milk and honey. And I said, continue, Rabbi, continue. And he said, what do you mean continue? I said, well, you're only giving us half of the deal, right? He said, well, what do you mean? I said, read the rest of the verse. And so we read it. So there shall be no poor among you. He said, Rabbi, you forgot to. So it was a deal, huh? It was, well, you might call it a covenant, all right? You shall have this land so that there shall be no poor among you. And I thought that Miriam should know this, that when she hears people say, oh, wait a second, God promised this stuff. It was a deal, and the Israelis, of course, have broken that deal in a scurrilous way. So that's the way I started out. I went into some of the more recent history, but, go back to the Hebrew scriptures. It's very clear what God's promise was, assuming you think this is important. And of course, the settlers think it's important. That's why they always cite it.
Ray, two things. One, it would be one thing if the scripture said, I will give you this land of milk and honey so that you will not be poor. But that's not what it says. It says so that there will not be poor among you. And there's also a reason why those individuals are called settlers. And there's also a reason why that region is called the occupied territories.
That's right, Wilmer. And, it's an embarrassing history we Americans have because we were settlers on a land peopled by Native Americans. And we kind of pushed them aside, just as Israel has pushed the Palestinians aside. So it's not a happy history. But when you're a settler, well, that's a nice way of putting that you're coming from outside and you've displaced people who have a right to live on those lands. So, when, as I said in the beginning of this piece, I came from the Bronx. I lived there for my first 22 years before I went in and served as an Army officer. Now, when I was 9 years old, 1948, oh man, it was sort of like the 4th of July 10 times over. Israel had a home, right? And as I noted at the beginning, well, nobody told me. Nobody told me that it was not a land for people, a land without any people in it. Well, there were people in it. And, that's the basic part of all this. And, if you go more recent in history, I was serving as a CIA analyst in 1967 when the Israelis attacked Egypt and Syria, decimated their air force, and enlarged Israeli territory to include parts of Syria, to include the West Bank, to include the Sinai, to include Gaza, lots of places to include, all right? Okay. Now, we thought, or we were told, that Egypt was about to attack Israel. Well, that was the legends put forward for many years after 1967. But finally, Menachem Begin, a former Israeli prime minister, got up before an audience in Washington in 1982. And, call it chutzpah, call it honesty, call it a cleansing of his conscience. But this is what he said. It's not long. I want to read it so that I don't mess it up. All right. Menachem Begin, former Israeli prime minister. Quote, in June 1967, we had a choice. The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches do not prove that Sennacherib is really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him. Period. End quote. It was duly reported in the New York Times, and people in New York and elsewhere where I was living, like, oh, isn't that interesting? So the Israelis said, well, that's called aggression. That's creating Lebensraum, okay, not terribly dissimilar from what happened in the 30s at the hands of the Nazis in Germany. And so that's the truth behind all this. Now, how did the UN react then, back in 67 when all this happened? There was unanimous Security Council resolution 242, that called for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. Was it a close vote? It was unanimous, okay? Did the Israelis do that? No, they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? Because of chutzpah, because the Israelis can always depend on the United States to defend them no matter what they do. And so they have occupied all those territories. They gave back the Sinai to Egypt when there was an agreement under Jimmy Carter, but the Sinai is not worth keeping, actually. Now the people in Gaza are bearing the brunt of this occupation, this oppression. And as I quoted Rabbi Heschel, one of my very favorite people who marched with Dr. King back in the late 60s, that, we're not all guilty, but we are all responsible. How did I put it, or how did he put it? Indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. And that's what we have to measure up to this time. There's been evil in Gaza, and we have to make sure that we don't one-sidedly accuse one side and give the other a free ride, so to speak, as has been the case since the U.S. reacted to the UN resolution. It didn't do diddly, as we say in the Bronx, to enforce it.
There's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of disinformation and outright lies that are being used in support of the Zionist U.S. narrative of this illegal occupation of Palestine, as well as the genocide of Palestinians. I want to read a brief statement and then show a map before I come back to you. Here's a statement. This is from the Foreign Office, the 2nd of November, 1917, and it reads, Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur James Balfour. Now, this is known as the Balfour Declaration. The British government decided in 1917 to endorse the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine, not Israel, Palestine. After discussions within the cabinet and the consulting with the Jewish leaders, the decision was made public, and we have this letter. To that point, here's a map from National Geographic from 1947, where you can see Lebanon, Syria, Transjordan, Egypt, and Palestine. Israel is not on this map. Why? Because contrary to the dominant Western narrative, Israel did not exist. That's why we know now Israel is actually the occupied territories. Ray, people will have a tendency to try to categorize this conversation as anti-Semitic, which is why, if we can put the map back up one more time, I want to be sure that people see this map. This is history. This is not narrative. This is not rhetoric. This is history. Ray Mcgovern.
Well, history can be very anti-Semitic. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to realize that most Americans are blissfully unaware of all this. The maps show the story. Now, the situation right now is different.
Mm-hmm.
How is it different? Well, the Soviets. I used to be a Soviet analyst, an analyst of Russian foreign policy. The Soviets used to talk about a concept called the correlation of forces. Now, it's not rocket science, okay? It had to do with the balance of power in the world. Now, guess what, folks? The balance of power in the world has shifted, okay? People are now talking about a shift from a unipolar world, which is what the U.S. was since World War II, and particularly since the Soviet Union fell apart, okay, to a multipolar world where other countries are allowed to have a say in these things. Well, I look at it as a bipolar world. And I would refer more recently just to yesterday's vote at the UN, where the U.S. was the only one to veto a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, calling for the Israelis not to ethnically cleanse Gaza, as they apparently still intend to do. So what's my point? My point is that everyone, not even the British, voted with us this time, okay? 12-1 was with 2 abstentions. So what am I saying? I'm saying that the Arab countries, well, here's an example. The Arab ambassadors in Beijing asked the Chinese, please get us all together. We need to talk about what's going to happen in Gaza, and the Chinese did. The head of Iran calls up arch rival, the head of Saudi Arabia, and says, we got to do something about this. And they have a cordial conversation, okay? Next thing you know, he's talking to the head of Hamas. He's talking to the head of Hezbollah, okay? So there are things that are happening here where, it's a no-brainer, where the deck is being stacked heavily against the United States and its satraps like the UK and France and Germany. They're not very long for this world, those governments, okay? So what we have here is a condition where 20 years ago, the U.S. could work its will, okay? No longer can it. Hamas is well equipped. I don't think that killing civilians is a good idea.
Nor do I.
When you look at it, you say, well, was this unprovoked? Unprovoked seems to be the adjective of choice here, okay? Just as Putin's decision to defend his compatriots in the Donbass was not unprovoked, neither was Hamas's reaction here. without making any moral judgments, which is something that intelligence analysts are not called to do, actually. We can say, you can understand this given the recent history and the more distant history that we've referred to earlier.
I'm very glad that you put it that way, because a lot of times people misconstrue, and I'll just put this on a personal level. I'm not an intelligence analyst, but I am a political scientist, not a political operative. And so people have a tendency to misconstrue my explanation of events with my agreeing with the events, my saying, I understand why President Putin and Russia went into Ukraine. I understand it because I understand the history. I understand why Hamas took the actions that it did. I don't condone the killing of civilians. I don't condone the killing of children, but I understand why Hamas did what they did. If you could quickly, Tony Blinken, you were just talking about the shift from the unipolar to the multipolar world. Talk a little bit about Tony Blinken and this whole concept of the rules-based order, because Tony Blinken and the Biden administration, they love to talk about the rules-based order, but when you try to find a definition of it, you can't, because it only exists in the mind of Tony Blinken. They rarely talk about international law. They always want to talk about the rules-based order.
You put your finger on it. The rules-based international order. Well, it's a contrived expression. It's meant to substitute for international law and the United Nations. It was invented by Blinken and Sullivan and Nolan. And Putin and Lavrov, the foreign minister, have made fun of it. Well, tell us about this. We try to Google it, but we don't. Could you please give us? Can you give us a piece of paper to describe what the rules-based international order? And of course they can't. And what it means is what we say goes. We make the rules, and that's it.
And you follow our orders.
Yeah, people are getting wise to that. An increasing number of people witnessed the vote at the UN yesterday, 12-1, the one being the United States. The saving grace here, as I see it, is that the UN is still being respected by China, by Russia, and by some of the other countries that are insisting that we abide by UN regulations. First and foremost, in this context, UN Security Council Resolution 242 of November 22nd, 1967, ordering Israel to relinquish control of the occupied territories that they seized in 1967. So what's the hope here? Well, the hope was yesterday. The U.S. talks about Russia being isolated. Well, look, and maybe, just maybe, these Zionists, and I'll use that word advisedly. Joe Biden has bragged about being a real dyed-in-the-wool Zionist. So has Blinken and Sullivan, the rest of them. Okay, what does that mean? That means the people that occupied the Palestinian territories, occupied by Palestinians just as Native Americans in our example, 4 centuries before. It doesn't make sense. And it's not going to make any headway, no matter how much we invoke this rules-based international order. Thanks for raising that, because it's very telling how we thought that we could just invent a new phrase and substitute it for international law and the UN.
President Biden, when he went to the region on this so-called peacekeeping tour, or wherever the heck he was supposed to be doing, he talked about peace. And to your point, earlier on, not on this trip, but earlier on, he was very clear. I am a Zionist. And then Tony Blinken goes and he says, I am here not only as the Secretary of State of the United States, but I'm here as a Jew. What message do you think that sends to the Arabs in the region, who he allegedly is supposed to be trying to find some common ground with and bring about some type of peaceful resolution to this conflict?
Well, I think the word is chutzpah and naivete. If Blinken doesn't know how that goes over with the Arab leaders that he's talking to, he's hopelessly blind.
Wait a minute, Ray. Does he?
Yeah.
Does he care? Because I remember very clearly, probably 2 years ago, when Blinken went to Anchorage, Alaska, to meet with the Chinese delegation, and the Chinese delegation got up and said, "We're not going to sit here and let you lecture us. We're China. We don't have to sit here and listen to you." And they got up and walked out of the room. That, to me, sounds eerily reminiscent, or what just transpired with Tony Blinken in the Middle East sounds eerily reminiscent to what he tried to do with the Chinese.
Well, Wilmer, you probably have seen President Biden reading from his little notes, even in a very short session with Netanyahu. So who writes the notes?
Tony Blinken.
Well, Blinken writes the notes.
Victoria Nuland.
Now, what do
Jake
Blinken
Sullivan
and Victoria Nuland have in common? What does Jacob Sullivan have in common? They're all of Jewish extraction. Now, should that ordinarily matter? No. Does it matter now? It happens to matter now. We're talking about a Jewish homeland created at the expense of the Palestinian people. We're talking about Zionism, which is a political movement, not a religion. So the three top people at the State Department have traditionally been Zionists, not only Jews, but Zionists. Now, this is not lost on the Middle East leaders or China or Russia. And you could see their hold on Biden from the very first part of his administration. The first thing he did was got up and he said, now China is going to has aspirations to be the most powerful country in the world, not only economically, but strategically. That's not going to happen on my watch. Okay. Next thing he does is he lets himself be set up by George Stephanopoulos, who says, now, Mr. President, do you think Putin's a killer? And Biden, oh, yeah, he's a killer. Okay. And then they meet with the Chinese at Anchorage and read them the riot act about the rules, basically. And the Chinese say, we know all about this. We spent a century throwing off your predecessors, the British, selling with the gun-to-mouth diplomacy. That's over, folks. And as you say, they didn't put up with it. So you have, at the very outset of his administration, laying down the line, look, we're all powerful, which is not the case anymore. We're Zionists, which happens to be the case anymore. I think, let me adduce one sort of comment that Biden made without reading from his little cards there. I think it was on the plane coming home yesterday. He said, I made a note of it. He says, I can understand why people in the Mideast region would not believe the Israelis. Or that maybe the bombing of that hospital was not intentional. Huh? Well, I can understand why the people of that region would not believe the Israelis. The question is why you believe him, Joe Biden. And, whether now Jacob Sullivan, I have to tell you, people object to my saying Jacob Sullivan, but that's his first name, okay? Just like, remember Scooter Libby, who worked for Cheney? His first name was Israel Libby. So why does he go by Scooter? Why does Jacob go by Jake? I don't know, but I can make a little guess here, okay? Jacob Sullivan is Zionist as the Nolans and the Blinkens of this world, and of course the president who styles himself as the supreme Zionist. What does that mean? Well, it means that it's over with the U.S. and Israel. It's just going to take a couple of months now for people to realize that. And the fear I have, Wilmer, the fear I have is that there's too much at stake personally for President Biden and for Blinken and Nod and Sullivan and Nolan and Hunter Biden. There's too much at personal stake for them to go away quietly and acknowledge the new correlation of forces. If they lose the wars, if they lose the election, they could end up in jail. The evidence is there in court documents, in sworn testimony, bribery, impeachment proceedings may go forward. So, what we're saying, I don't give a rat's patootie about what happens in impeachment consideration. What I care about is how they are likely to react to save their own patooties, okay? And that introduces an element of instability and personal stake that worries me greatly. And, it doesn't matter what worries Mcgovern greatly. I'm sure it worries Russian and Chinese leaders greatly too, and has them on tenterhooks as to what will happen over the next year.
When you look at the surveys right now, when you look at the polling data, the race for 2024 between President Biden and former President Trump, by most polls, is a dead heat. It's within 1 or 2 points. It's within the margin of error. History tells us that countries tend not to shift leadership or change leadership in the midst of conflict/war. You mentioned if they lose the election. You mentioned if they lose the war, if they lose the election. Does Joe Biden need this conflict in his mind in order to save his administration?
I don't think Joe Biden is compos mentis. I think that Blinken and Sullivan, Nolan, they are extremely compos mentis, okay? They have a lot to fear. Let's say that Trump wins the election. As I said before, the evidence is out there, not only of bribery and those kinds of things, and Hunter Biden's laptop and the inclusion of corrupt former intelligence officials and all that kind of stuff. But, Blinken was personally involved in arranging for Biden to win via a subterfuge. What do I mean? Well, when Hunter Biden's laptop was revealed and the scurrilous repeat stuff on it, and his dealings with calling his father's brand name into, well, how did they decide to handle that? It was 3 weeks before the election. Oh, what happened? Well, by testimony to Congress by a former acting director of the CIA, his name is Mcgovern. He said, I got a call from Tony Blinken. And he said, the best way to handle the Hunter Biden laptop is, could you get former intelligence directors to say that it has all the earmarks of a Russian intelligence disinformation operation? And Mcgovern said, sure, I can do that. 3 days later, Mcgovern has rounded up 50, count them, 50 former intelligence directors and very high officials. Speaks pretty poorly of them, doesn't it? 50 plus Mcgovern. And he says 51 former intelligence directors, including 4 or 5 former directors of the CIA, as if that enhances their credibility, say this has all earmarks of a Russian intelligence disinformation operation. Now, was that consequential? Well, all I know is that 2 days later, Joe Biden had his last debate with Trump. And Trump raised this. And Biden said, "Oh, don't you know that this is all the earmarks of a Russian intelligence operation?" Now, why do I go into that detail? I mean, that should not have happened. Okay, I don't know whether that won the election for Biden or not, but you don't do these things. They have to be illegal, in my view. So Blinken himself is on tenterhooks. He could be prosecuted. He could be put in jail. And Jacob Sullivan, just a word about him, he invented Russiagate. The non-existent Russian hacking of the DNC computer for Hillary Clinton's emails and all this stuff that showed that she had stolen the nomination for Bernie Sanders. That was Sullivan. He was a big campaign manager for Hillary Clinton. So that's all out there. Now, I don't know if Trump came in, and I will not comment on what I think of Trump. If he came in, he's not loath to hold these people accountable. And on this case, he's got the law behind him. So again, there's great incentive on the part of all these people preparing the notes for Joe Biden to keep the war going in Ukraine and not lose before the election, and to help the Israelis to the degree the U.S. can still not lose in Gaza. The last one is not possible anymore. Neither is the first one. So what am I afraid of? I'm afraid that they will react according to this personal stake they have. And, it's happened before. When you have this kind of personal stake, and you have advisors like these guys who are saying, "Joe, look, if we lose this, look what happens." Then you don't have to write notes to Joe. He understands this. He's a politician, and that's what worries me. Sorry to carry on at that length, but I think this is an important aspect that's not really covered elsewhere.
You are a former intelligence official, and you understand the subtleties of diplomacy. And one of the things that I find very interesting is when you listen to President Putin, when you listen to President Xi, when you listen to Raisi in Iran, they speak in very subtle undertones. So when Donald Trump assassinated General Soleimani, Iran said, we're gonna retaliate. And a lot of people expected the retaliation to be coming shortly thereafter. It did not come. Well, as Tony Blinken was traversing the Middle East recently, the Iranian foreign minister was doing the same thing with his allies and released a statement saying, "Israel, the time is up." Did that convey to you a not so subtle message that people need to be paying attention to?
Well, it does. And that's really one outstanding aspect of what happened over the last week. The notion that the president of Iran would call up the leader of Saudi Arabia to coordinate on what they're going to do. I mean, that's a tectonic shift in the relations between those two countries. And, Raisi, the president of Iran, has been traveling all around, and he's got, he talks to the Syrians, and he talks to the Egyptians, and actually the Egyptians and the Jordanians wouldn't even receive Joe Biden when he wanted to see them. So, what we need to do is recognize.
And Mohammed bin Salman made Tony Blinken wait an entire day, actually overnight, because I guess he had gone fishing somewhere in Saudi Arabia, and he was on a fishing trip in Saudi Arabia and couldn't be bothered. So he made Tony, that again, from a diplomatic perspective, that's one of those not so subtle messages that says, I really don't feel like being bothered with you.
Yeah, and Saudi Arabia is very, very, very important, not only because of the oil, but because of the rapprochement that was going on with China and with others. So, maybe the Saudi foreign minister was supervising some beheadings in the public square, or
Could be.
you get pretty busy in Saudi Arabia.
When
In
heads
any
start rolling.
case, and I understand he did give Blinken access to a men's room there as he waited. So I don't know, there's some niceties that were observed, but keep away overnight. You don't do that with, at least you didn't used to do that with the Secretary of State of the United States of America. The least of all would the Saudi Arabians have done that. So that's just one little symptom of the tectonic shift in relations, where U.S. is no longer the unipolar power, but rather a bipolar with them, with the United States. And I'm an American citizen. I really mourn the fact that because of our own ineptitude and chutzpah, we put ourselves in this situation. And I dare say that if the Israelis do what everyone thinks they're going to do now, it's going to be all hell to pay, because the Iranians, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Egyptians, the Hezbollah, the others, even the Saudis, for God's sake, are not going to sit around and tolerate the decimation of 2 million people in Gaza.
The Yemen isn't going to be too happy with this either.
Yemen as well, yeah.
So people watching this, people listening to this, they may be saying, "Wow, Wilmer, you and Ray are spending an awful lot of time talking about foreign policy, talking about the Middle East. We have homelessness in the United States. We have abject poverty. We have all these declines in the standard of living in the United States. Why spend so much time talking about this instead of talking about that?"
Well, because they're connected, as you well know. Every billion you send to Ukraine, every billion you send to Israel is at the expense of these people, the poor people in our country that need all that kind of help. There shall be no poor among you. Well, that's a universal. That's a universal in my view.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't have to be a Hebrew scripture. I mean, the Christian, and I say Judeo-Christian attitude toward justice. Wilmer, we have this American concept of justice where you have this blind lady, of all people, holding these scales, and the image is impartiality, image no favoritism to one or the other. Now, let me tell you something, and your listeners. The Judeo-Christian, the biblical concept of justice is unbalanced and biased to the core in favor of the poor, the Anawim, the hated poor, as the Old Testament called. The very word in pre-Aramaic for justice, tetka, denotes, not connotes, denotes showing mercy to the poor. Now, that used to be kind of observed. FDR, my father's favorite president, he cried when FDR died. He knew in his heart what he needed to do for poor people. He brought us out of that depression, okay? Mm-hmm. There used to be a Democratic Party that cared mostly about the poor. When I asked my father, I said, "Dad, what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican?" He said, "All Democrats care about people, okay, care about poor people." Well, that ain't the case anymore. They're all kind of joined at the hip. And what do they care about? Stuffing their own pockets. What was really a revelation to me was when Pope Francis came to Congress, 2015, I think it was, and there was a joint section, right? And he stands up there And to his credit, Pope Francis says, and I quote, "The main problem today is the blood-soaked arms trade." Okay, the main problem today is the blood-soaked arms trade, period, end quote. Now, what do those congressmen, what do the senators do? Oh, they go, they say, oh, yeah, right. And they stood up, right? And then they looked in their pockets to see if the envelope from Raytheon was still there and the one from Lockheed over here. I mean, it was giving hypocrisy a bad name, okay? These guys know what the message was, but they're so soaked in this money and this power that it's going to take a lot of us who care about the poor, and a lot of us who can show what they call opportunity costs is what the economists use, okay?
Mhm.
For every $150 million you spend on creating an F-35, what could be done in your school district to pay the teachers a decent wage? What could be done in Iowa or Nebraska or any of these places which are being downtrodden, okay? People need to make this very specific. This money is going to these people that are making $20-30 million a year as salaries as CEOs of Raytheon, Lockheed, General Dynamics. That ain't sustainable. We need to get up and find out where these people live, shame them into relenting a little bit and saying, look, maybe 10 million is enough for your salary, and maybe we'll give the balance to the poor. So to round this thing up, I happen to be out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and this reinforces my imperative to honor the concept of justice, which is not balanced in favor of everybody, because it's not a level playing field. It's unbalanced. It's biased and prejudiced to the core in favor of the poor. Now, that's what I come out of as a faith perspective. I'll just add one other thing. I had a Jesuit teacher who was a real good friend of mine. I said, well, how would you describe your theology? I said, oh, it's very simple. I can put it in one sentence. I said, what's that? He says, well, it all depends on what kind of God you believe in and how God feels when little people are pushed around, period, end quote. Okay, I'll say that again. And how God feels when little people are pushed around. Now, you don't have to believe in God. You could just believe in justice. I had agnostics and atheists tell me, look, Ray, you don't have to go into the Bible here. Human beings know that we're supposed to be fair. And that's true. Human beings used to know that. We need to get back on the track here and do everything we can to make sure they realize that now. The more so since things are getting very, very perilous for us, not only in Ukraine, but in Western Asia, as it's called now.
In mentioning Ukraine, you also have a piece at your website, raymcgovern.com, entitled Fact Checking Putin on Ukraine. President Putin gave an interview right before he went to China for the Belt and Road Initiative conference. And you say media consumers should be permitted to learn what Putin said, particularly about Ukraine and Russia's problems dealing with various U.S. administrations over the years. Readers who rely on the, quote, paper of record, end quote, however, will be shielded from his remarks and thus any temptation to ask if they might be true. And you went through a lot of what Russian President Putin had to say. You did your own fact checking. And what were some of the conclusions that you came to regarding President Putin's, the veracity of his comments?
Well, I checked them all, and there were two that I needed to consult others on because I wasn't 100% sure. One had to do with when Russian forces went up there near Kiev and were abruptly withdrawn very early in the war in Ukraine. I always wondered about that. Putin claims that that was part of a deal, okay? Not a covenant, but at least a deal. Now, what was the deal? The deal was reached with Ukrainian officials in Belarus and in Turkey. There was a deal to stop the war, to have a ceasefire, to commit Ukraine not to join NATO, and to bring Russian troops down from where they were threatening Kiev. That's what Putin claims. Now, I checked around because, my memory is just one person, but I found out, that's probably why the Russian troops went down from that area. It's not because they couldn't have taken Kiev, although they didn't really have all that many troops there. But the Russians, from the very outset of their special military operation, appealed to the Ukrainians, look, we'd like to have a deal here. All we want is some respect for our own security. We don't want NATO coming in as a bulwark against us. Now, what happened? Well, the Ukrainians talked, and they reached an agreement in Ankara on the 31st of March, 2022, and it said these things that I just spelled out. What happened? Well, the U.S., in the person of Boris Johnson from the UK, he visited Kiev right away and said, no deal. You may be willing to deal with the Russians, but we're not. We want to continue this thing. The object here is to give the Russians a bloody nose, a strategic defeat, okay? And so what did Zelensky do? Oh, okay, sorry, won't do that anymore, okay? That's how that thing went down. Now, I remember reading this in Ukrainskaya Pravda, okay? It's the official organ in Ukraine. I mean, that's pretty good. But when I had confirmation about this from some of the people who know the military situation a little better than I did, I said, yeah, well, that was correct too. Now, Wilmer, without belaboring this, I have to tell you that after fact-checking all this and trying to offer this as an alternative view by somebody who had fact-checked it, I couldn't get it published. I couldn't get it published on a very, well, what we shall say, a very anti-war website.
But Ray, that's got to be impossible, because Joe Biden has told us that we stand for democracy, that Putin is a dictator and that he's an autocrat, and we stand for the freedom of press. And so that's in America, Ray. How could you not get something like that published?
Well, I guess my point, Wilmer, here is that I've long since stopped trying to get something in the Times or the Washington Post. I used to be able to do that 10 years ago, okay, like twice a year. But, the alternative media, for God's sake, the progressive media is now saying, oh, that sounds a little bit too pro-Russian. My God. So here I check these things. I double check with the people who know about things they're not quite sure about. I put it out there and say, well, that sounds a little bit too pro-Russian. We can't run that. So that's the alternative media. That's the bind where nobody wants to feel like they could be susceptible to criticism of being pro-Putin. That, my friend, is how bad it has become.
I was at dinner with some friends, and one of them asked kind of a generic question about this media and whose interests are being served. And, this can't be some invisible cabal that is behind the scenes, being sure that a particular narrative is only being articulated. And I said, no, I said, it doesn't really have to be a cabal, because when you look at Jeff Bezos, for example, and he owns the Washington Post, and he owns Amazon. And look at where Jeff Bezos has received most of his money from, Amazon Data Systems, which is a defense contractor. I said, look at what's his name that owns Tesla, and he controls X. And where does he get most of his money from? SpaceX and Starlink, defense contractors. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a cabal as much as it is the confluence of interests that understand which side their bread is buttered on. Is that fair to say?
Well, Wilmer, I have an expression or an acronym called the MICIMAT, the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academia Think Tank Complex. It's in some dictionaries now, okay? Why do I say media? Because the media is controlled by the rest of the MICIMAT. That's the situation we're in now. Now, you mentioned Jeff Bezos, and you correctly pointed out he gets lots of money from the federal government, CIA, and others, okay? But the people he picks, well, there was a fellow named Fred Hyatt, who ran the editorial section of the Washington Post, like the op-ed section, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And before the war in Iraq, about 90% of the op-eds were, oh yeah, they're weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass. Okay, so what happens? After the war, when there are no weapons of mass destruction, he goes up to the Columbia School of Journalism, and when a naive student says, Mr. Hyatt, you kept saying that there were weapons of mass destruction as flat fact, and it turned out not to be any. How do you explain that? And Hyatt famously said, well, if there weren't weapons of mass destruction, we probably should not have said that there were. Now, my patron, Robert Perry of recent memory, turned to me at that and he said, Ray, that used to be sort of like a cardinal principle of journalism. Like if something's not true, you're not supposed to say it is, okay? What happened to Fred Hyatt? He stayed in place for 20 more years running the op-ed section. So what's my point? No one is held accountable for these things. That's up to us. We have to find ways to hold people accountable. And what that involves, I leave to people, but we have to start getting off our rear ends. We have to put our bodies into it, as I have in the past. They're not going to kill you. They beat you up a little, put you in prison. So, but, it's worth it because so much is at stake right now. And I've never seen a more tentative, a more dangerous time to include the prospect of the use of mini nuclear weapons, which eventually would do us all in.
We have just about a minute and a half or so left, and I want to read. This is from MSNBC, and this is from the April 6th, 2022. In a break with the past, U.S. is using intel to fight an info war with Russia, even when the intel isn't rock solid. What that means, boys and girls, is MSNBC is admitting that they are lying to the American people under the pretext of the noble lie. They're lying to you, boys and girls. Ray Mcgovern, where can people, first of all, Ray, thank you so much for your time today, and where can folks find your work?
Well, I'm sure that Plato and his noble lie are kind of turning around in the grave right now.
Where can people find your work?
Oh, where people? Okay. Well, I'm Twittering. That's at Ray Mcgovern.
Okay.
My website is raymcgovern.com. I'm also on Facebook and on Instagram. So I hope that you'll tune in. My son, who runs my website, always says, Ray, always add, if you don't get it,